Okay, it's 2 o'clock in the UK, 3 o'clock Central European time. Not sure what time it is in India or in Manitoba, but I'm Mary McHugh and I'm welcoming you on behalf of RENATE to this parallel event of the Commission on the Status of Women 66, which is brought to you by RENATE, which is the Religious in Europe Network Against Trafficking and Exploitation. I'm going to be trying to keep the time, and I'm also going to explain to you that this is a webinar, so you will not be seen on it, but you will be able to see the panelists. If you can write questions in the chat line, then we will have a question and answer session at the end after all the speakers have spoken. There will also be some short films between the speakers, and I'll introduce them as we go along. So, as a first step, I would like to introduce Sister Imelda Poole, who is the president of RENATE, and I'll hand over to her at this point. Thank you, Imelda.
Thanks, Mary. Good morning, evening, and afternoon to everybody here. It's a joy for us to be gathered as the RENATE network and to invite you to join us on a journey. We're a network that collaborates right across Europe in 31 European countries, and we have approximately about 300 members or organizations that we work with very closely, as you'll see along the way. Basically, it's important for you to know that we're not alone as religious and co-workers in Europe, because we are under the umbrella of an international body headed in Rome by Talitha Kum. And there are networks of religious and co-workers in every continent in the world. And together we make up a powerhouse that in particular on certain days of the year, shout out our cry for justice, to work and speak with the survivors and the victims of human trafficking who are being so incredibly abused across the world on the market of the greed and the demand of people who are looking for a cheap cut from the human life and the distraction of the young person. So we're founded under the Dutch law approximately 10 years ago. And what is our policy and vision? RENATE in particular is particularly concerned with ensuring that every single survivor and victim receives full justice in the law to ameliorate their abuse. We believe that it should be human rights informed according to the law, and in particular, that it is trauma informed all the practice of work with survivors and victims, so that time is given and patience and compassion to the person who has been so heavily abused by the traffickers. We also are ensuring throughout our network that the victim or survivor is at the center of the work, the voice, the person, the needs, the desires. This is our aim, and this is how we practice. The causes of human trafficking concern us deeply, and the manner in which the justice for the survivor is not heard and not implemented. So we look at a world where demand and greed and the need for cheap services, cheap goods, cheap whatever, in order that profit is the focus for the individual, is the concern of pretty well the whole population of our world today. And so the millions that are starving and the millions who are vulnerable are the very millions that the traffickers target. So our greed, our demand, impacts the growing division between the rich and the poor. So we call on, and this is our RENATE's call at the moment in our vision, that corporates and finance and governments open their eyes, their ears, and their hearts to work together in collaboration to see this crime and to work together. And I emphasize that word over and over again as Renate, that these three major bodies will address the causes of human trafficking and help those of us at the grassroots to change the world and to rid the world of human trafficking within the next 10 years, which is our aim. I'm going to now share the PowerPoint just to help you perhaps see a little more of what we're about in RENATE. Doesn't seem to be moving on, so let's see what we've got. There. And could you share it for me, please? Doesn't seem to be moving, despite our little practice. Okay. I'll carry on speaking anyway.
Okay.
Are you able to do that, Brian, for me?
I think I can.
Thank you. Okay, so the first slide that Brian will be showing you of our introduction to RENATE is of women. This is the CSW, the Commission for the Status of Women. And so today we're thinking in particular of women who have been exploited and abused, but also the title of this year's CSW links abuse and exploitation of women with climate change. And we know that climate change has led to the most incredible vulnerability. Thanks, Brian. If we could move to slide 2, that would be great. And in these pictures, which I'll describe, here we see Ukrainian women and children fleeing the war in Ukraine. A gross mismanagement of justice in our world today and so close to our borders in Europe. We have 2 survivors who are speaking out themselves against this injustice, visiting Pope Francis. We have women who are marching all the time throughout history for justice for the most vulnerable. A woman with a voice is by definition a strong woman, but the search to find that voice can be remarkably difficult. And so we are saying as RENATE, let our voice be heard, let us not be timid, let us speak out for justice. And we are grateful that so many men like Brian amongst us today is joining us in this voice of power speaking out for justice in our world. Thanks, Brian. This is a small organogram of RENATE. You will see that it's a massive sharing of leadership. We are working from a feminine perspective. We have 10 task groups now. We have core groups. We have the working board. We have part-time staff, collaborators and partners, and country groups, all in leadership, enabling the mission of RENATE to be implemented very majestically, really, and massively in touch with the grassroots. Thank you. This is part of the latest evaluation tool. And why I wanted to show you this is because it shows that 71% of the membership are working at grassroots. So they are listening to the survivors, they're listening to the victims, they are being informed and they are being led. Our membership is led by the survivor's voice. Yes, we're in advocacy, capacity building, research, and so much more. But in fact, all that we do is informed by the survivor. Thank you, Brian. And therefore, we hear the cry. We may not always hear it clearly, but we try to hear the cry as it unfolds year by year, month by month. And last year, the cry was from the children. Through COVID, the massive explosion of trafficking, sex trafficking online was really almost diabolical. There were children as young as 6 being raped online, being ordered by people who wished to see such pornography online, live streamed as we speak. And what really came about through this training of the RENATE members in this, so that we could be made more aware of this present day explosion of evil, was that we realized that in fact the law in Europe actually covered the perpetrator of this law of sex trafficking online, whereas the child was not covered by law. So through lobbying and campaigning, the EU did put in a temporary law to protect the children. And this is our role, not on our own, but with IJM, who led the field in this, and many other organizations. So we as RENATE have to keep up listening. We can't sit back and say we know, we don't. It's changing all the time. Thank you, Brian. And so last year at this very same event of CSW, we were invited by the Good Shepherds to join them in an exhibition booth. And consequent to that, we actually presented 12 webinars. And these are now forming our toolkit for raising awareness against human trafficking, because they covered the whole gamut of the whole work against human trafficking. So if you yourselves wish to use any of our resources, they are present, not all of these yet because they're being edited, but we have many resources on our website that you can use, and we'll put the website address in the chat. Thank you, Brian. So we make the most of every single platform that we have the advantage to be part of, such as the EU Civil Society platform, the UN Geneva platform, the conference of the Council of Europe. Here we have Mary, who represents us on the Council of Europe. And we speak whenever we can at European or presentations, such as here with the OSC and UN Geneva with Anna Stakai from Albania. Thank you. And finally, we come to what is our subject today. Last year and the year before, we worked with St Mary's University in Twickenham, London, to conduct a research about the poverty of legal aid that was available for victims of human trafficking. And it was just a shocking experience for those of us working in the field, how difficult or how expensive it was to get justice, and so few traffickers were being convicted. In fact, today we know that only 0.99% of traffickers are prosecuted. In fact, only 1% of trafficked are assessed and go through the NRM in Europe. So we have a very sad situation according to the law and government will and so on. So this research is going to be unfolded in our webinar today. And I need to say no more, but this was the launching of the research in order to really get the facts and figures about to what degree legal aid is accessible to victims and survivors of human trafficking across Europe. Thank you. So we act and we stay with hope, as with Greta, in climate change. The UN Secretary General, speaking on International Women's Day this year, said in all countries, women are scandalously underrepresented in the halls of power and the boardrooms of business. And as this year's theme reminds us, they bear the brunt of climate change and environmental degradation. Through effective action to end gender-based violence, such as human trafficking, we attempt to create a more humane and just world. Human trafficking comes out of dysfunctionality, of a broken world where the poor are abandoned in the mess of it all. So now we're going to show a film. It's a small teaser film of RENATE, and it just illustrates at the grassroots the work of the foundation. Thanks, Brian.
We're going to think out to mission, we're going to think big and wide, and we're going to think of the traffic victim and what we can really do working together right across Europe. I do believe that, yes.
We are demanding cheap goods, cheap clothes, cheap services, but who's paying the price for these?
They migrated because of the poverty after the communism regime fall, and they went abroad to find a better life.
The women, I mean, generally, they don't fight. They are okay, they are obedient, and they are sad, but they don't give trouble.
Every Wednesday we go out to meet our friends. We call them amici della strada, our friends on the roads.
Perché queste ragazze vengono, come dire, irretite nel loro paese perché scappano da situazioni di miseria, di povertà.
Probably been threatened, and their families are generally threatened as well back in Vietnam. So there is a controlling issue.
Our vision and our idea is to expand it. It is also a chance for other women to be employed, because this is our aim and this is our goal, to support the women in need.
Sisters from different congregations, different nationalities, having the same aim, the same vision, helping these young people.
Thank you very much, Imelda, and thank you for showing the film, Mariana. Right, now I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Brian O'Toole. Brian works in Dublin, Ireland at the Interprovincial Justice Desk for the Presentation Order of Sisters in England and Ireland. He provides information on issues relating to their status as observer NGO with ECOSOC at the UN. These congregations of women religious assist victims of trafficking with support and accommodation. Brian is a member of the RENATE Law Task Group and has been involved in the research which Imelda mentioned. So I'm going to hand over now to Brian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you, Imelda, for the lovely introduction. The RENATE Law Task Group is just one of the task groups that Sister Imelda referenced when she was speaking earlier. And we commissioned the Bakita Centre for Research on Slavery, Exploitation and Abuse, working out of St. Mary's University, to undertake an important piece of research for us. It was to be done in a short time frame during COVID across 6 countries: Albania, Bulgaria, England and Wales, Germany, Romania and Spain. This research essentially comprised of a mapping exercise to identify and to shine a light on 3 specific areas as they relate to the legal supports for victims of human trafficking. Firstly, on the awareness of victims of their rights and legal entitlements. And secondly, on the ability of victims to access these legal supports. And thirdly, on the quality of the legal supports that are available. So you might ask, why did we do this? Well, the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings and the EU Directive on Preventing and Combating Trafficking has set out minimum legal standard requirements for the EU member states to firstly identify, then protect, and then assist victims of trafficking. So that from a victim's point of view, this means that each victim has a right to a lawyer to protect their rights. Each victim has a right to be informed about their role in all proceedings, and each victim has a right to have their interests defended. And from our research, our report shows that despite these apparent entitlements, the legal aid situation for victims of trafficking across the EU is not only poorly understood, but it also varies widely. So our research in RENATE contributes to the knowledge on this topic, but it also gives us a snapshot in time of the current legal aid situation for victims of trafficking in 6 of the countries where RENATE operates. This is a beginning. It's a good start, as they say. We're currently discerning our next steps for further research, and today's event is very much a part of that process. So following a review of the literature, a carefully prepared online survey of about 25 questions in English and translated where necessary was sent to academics, to researchers, campaigners, practitioners, and civil society NGOs where victims of trafficking might go to avail of support. So what exactly did we find out? Well, I can only give you some of the standout findings because there's too much in the short space of time that I have. However, in all responding countries, there is evidence of poor victim identification. And this is extremely important because all entitlements to legal support only follow on from the successful identification of a victim of trafficking. Some countries are better than others. Some countries only identify victims in the sex industry, and some countries ignore boys and men. Some countries have no national human trafficking strategy, and in some countries, victims are mistrustful of authorities, and worse still, many victims of trafficking are right to be mistrustful of authorities. So what about the legal systems that claim to support a victim of trafficking? It appears that no responding country could offer that their system was truly trauma sensitive. The quality of and the access to legal support doesn't only differ widely between countries, it also differed within countries. All countries overpromised and all countries underdelivered. For example, some countries who claim anonymity do not deliver on this. Why, you might think? Is it either through incompetence or is it corruption? The chances are it could well be a little bit of both. It's also a factor that many of the victims claim that they only remain interesting insofar as they are evidence in a possible prosecution against a perpetrator. And if a case fails or falls, it happens that a victim can be denied further legal support. So what about those then who work in the system? Well, cases are complicated. Cases are long. Cases are sometimes cross-jurisdictional, and those who passionately advocate for victims are poorly paid and may have to wait until the very end of a long case before they're paid. Fixed fees for a fixed service nearly always falls far short of what's needed. Poor payment will mean that fewer advocates will commit to working with victims of trafficking. Also, and significantly, there is a large gap in the training at all levels. And this, we're talking about the judiciary, the police, frontline staff, and also when it comes to identifying victims. So what other things kind of cropped up in this report as we were gathering and collating our information? Many victims claim that their legal supports changed regularly without being told. Many victims were unaware of the rights and entitlements. And many who were aware of the rights and entitlements just didn't know how to go about accessing them. Many victims also said that continuous interpretation is something that's missing. All victims are entitled to a reflection and a recovery period, but this varies hugely depending on the country in which a victim is identified. Legal systems are poorly resourced, And this leaves victims of human trafficking furthest behind. Now, all legal systems claim to be poorly funded. However, we would think that the argument being that we would do more if we had more, as opposed to offering we should and could do more with what we have, which is what we think is how we think they should frame their argument. There are poor opportunities for redress or compensation if a victim is returned home. Sometimes where there is a hostile welcome for immigrants or asylum seekers, this same hostility is very often extended to victims of trafficking, and very unfairly so. Victims have a better chance of legal support if they live in a city than they would in a rural part of the country, even though we know that in every town, in every country, there are victims of human trafficking and modern slavery. NGOs with a specific mandate to support, accompany, counsel, or identify victims are all too often underfunded. And in many instances, contrary to state provision, they over-deliver as they rely on a compassionate, motivated, empathetic staff who work above and beyond the call to provide sanctuary. In all countries, we found a pro bono legal support structure. Thanks be to God, which is very welcome, but it really only represents the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's needed. But if you think about it, the very existence and the need for a pro bono network is indicative of clear gaps in the legal provision or the services that are needed for victims of human trafficking. In every country that responded, victims continue to be prosecuted for crimes that are directly related to being trafficked or coerced. And this is in clear breach of the non-punishment principle. They're just some of the findings, but there was things missing too, like what you might ask. Data. Firstly, good quality disaggregated data on the numbers of victims by sex, by age, by nationality over a specific period of time. Data that could be compared country to country is both valuable and necessary. And that brings us right back again for the second time to victim identification and training in victim identification. Good quality data allows for the effective delivery of service, a breadth of supports, provision of interpretive services, psychological services, shelters, and much, much more. But it also identifies gaps in services, as well as identifying needs, but in a timely manner. And that's key also. So now you have some idea of why we did the research and some idea of the findings, and there are many more. I urge you to take a look for yourself, and I intend to drop the report into the chat before the end of the event. But all of these findings help us to tease out specific recommendations. After all, what good is any report if it doesn't provoke further thought, prompt informed action, and offer practical recommendations that are victim-centered, which is key. So from our research, we recommend that lawyers should be paid more, trained better, encouraged to build a trusted relationship with the client, whom we hope they would accompany throughout the entire legal process. We recommend that criminal proceedings need to be victim-oriented, guaranteeing anonymity and safety of the victims. And this, by necessity, means that there must be better and more training. We recommend that where NGOs have a greater responsibility in legally supporting and identifying, they need to be adequately funded. And we recommend that greater resources need to be put into victim identification. Without identification, for the third time, there will be no legal supports. So these conclusions have led us to next steps, practical steps, which is the point of the research. We've already begun this work, taking the countries we've examined and others. We are now creating a directory that maps the scope and breadth of services available to all victims by country, allowing for a more seamless care of victims, irrespective of the country in which they've been identified. We've also identified the need for more comprehensive research that will take into account the lived experience of victims. Also, we're keen to identify incidences of good practice that they can be held up as the standard that all countries should aim for. And we also need to know a little bit more about the legal support for victims when they return home. And so now we urge you to consider our research, to help us to discern our next steps, to scaffold the current legal supports, to lobby on the gaps as we continue to highlight the shortcomings for victims of trafficking. So there you have it. And as you listen to the contributors that follow in this event, I hope you'll appreciate our first steps and that you'll understand the importance of further research as we collectively respond to the cry, as we act to free the enslaved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you for keeping to time and being so clear and so logical in your presentation. We now have a short film which is about survivors of trafficking in Albania. It highlights the importance of raising awareness about preventing human trafficking. So can we show that? Okay, Brian, while we're looking, oh, right.
Ka nevojë për mbështetje psikologjike, ligjore, strehim, shkollim, drejtësi.
Policia do të ndryshoj sjelljen me vajza që janë trafikuar, që të ndihen më mirë.
Formimi dhe sensibilizimi në programet mosimore do të rrisë njohuri dhe kapacitete dhe njerëzit do ishin më të vetëdijshëm ndaj mashtrimeve dhe nuk do binin prej atyre. Domethënë kjo gjë mund të parandalojë trafikimin.
Institucionet e drejtësisë duhet të trajtojnë viktimat në mënyrë më të ndjeshëm, më njerëzore dhe mos i shohin sikur të kenë bërë një faj.
Jam shumë larg nga familja dhe kam shumë të vështirë që t'i takoj sa herë që dëshiroj. Një gjë e nevojshme, domethënë, sipas mendimit tim, është prania më shumë qendrave sociale ose shërbimit social në Shqipëri.
Mësueset dhe psikologët vetë janë më të vëmendshëm në të shajat e trafikimit. Dhe duhet të denoncojnë në polici.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Brian. And now we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Mariana Meshi. Mariana is the Executive Director of the organization Different and Equal in Albania. This is an organization that provides sustainable and comprehensive services for the reintegration of victims of trafficking, abuse and exploitation in Albania. And it's a member of the National Referral Mechanism in Albania. Mariana has 20 years experience in addressing human trafficking and exploitation. Over to you, Mariana.
Thank you very much, Mary. Dear participants, it's my pleasure to share how their research findings relate to our practice in the ground, and I will talk from the perspective and the experience in Albania. Just I shared, okay. So I will talk first about how there is the legal framework on anti-trafficking in Albania, and then I will continue with some challenges we faced in the implementation of the legal framework that we have in Albania. Recently, Albania is implementing an extensive reform in justice system, and this reform has affected the measures taken against trafficking in human beings, including the protection of victims of trafficking, And we believe that these measures has prospects to improve the legal aid implementation for victims of trafficking. In Albania, the legal acts that regulate free legal aid and the rights of the victims of trafficking are the Criminal Procedures Code, and which was amended in 2017, and the new law on legal aid guaranteed from the state. Amendments to the Criminal Procedures Code have improved the position of victims of trafficking by enhancing the framework for their rights. But in the same time, I would like to note that the Criminal Procedures Code provide protection and legal aid only for victims of trafficking who actively participate in the criminal proceedings, so excluding those victims that do not cooperate with justice institutions. In all the other cases, then legal aid is regulated by the law on legal aid guaranteed by the state. According to this law, all victims of crime, whether Albanian national or foreign nationals, can access free legal aid, irrespective to their status or types of exploitation. However, despite the prescribed rights in the law, the implementation in the practice remains a challenge. So regarding the state-funded legal aid scheme, the scheme that is set up based on the law, although it is an important advancement, it does not necessarily guarantee effective legal aid and protection for victims of trafficking. From the practice, we have seen that despite the special status that is given to victims of trafficking, they are required to fill many forms and documents, which might be difficult or impossible to locate due to their special circumstances. The law does not provide possibilities for higher payments for lawyers, referring to the type of case they represent, and does not have a specific treatments for the trafficking on human being cases. And on the other hand, the list of lawyers engaged in providing secondary legal aid, which include also representation in the court, do not include a group of lawyers who are specialized in representing and protecting the rights and the interests of the victims of trafficking. Another challenge is that the state legal aid scheme do not ensure that the same lawyer who is present during the identification process, who in most of the cases is a lawyer that comes from NGO, to continue to assist victims through the entire process because the NGOs cannot provide secondary legal aid. Regarding the criminal proceedings and victim-centered approach, law enforcement, from the practice, we have seen that law enforcement agencies remained oriented to perpetrators and are less the victim-centered. And despite the legal changes and improvements made to increase the access to justice for victims, in practice, law enforcement have not succeeded to change their approach towards the victims. So often considering obligations that they have for the protection of victims as burden and as an obstacle to the progress of court proceedings. Besides that, the new amendments that are made on the Criminal Procedures Code has transferred the competences for trafficking in human being cases to the prosecution and district courts. And this transfer of competence have made it difficult to investigate and provide legal assistance for victims of trafficking, because we see that there is lack of specialized structures at district level to deal with trafficking in human being cases. And indeed in Albania, we see a drastic reduction of penal punishment of traffickers in the late years. Regarding the legal aid provided by NGOs, As I mentioned, according to the law, authorized NGOs that are part of the national scheme to provide legal aid can be financially supported by the state only for providing primary legal aid. But this creates a significant gap in terms of provision of secondary legal aid, which include the representation in court. Fact that doesn't ensure that the same lawyer continue to assist the victim through the entire process. And besides that, the funding procedures for NGOs remain complicated. And even during the last year, the application process, even it was open, failed, and none of the NGOs was financed by the government to provide legal aid. Regarding the identification of victims of trafficking, even we have standard operating procedures for the protection of victims of trafficking, and the procedures for obtaining the status of victims of trafficking still remain unclear because in standard operating procedures lacks the appeal procedure in case of refusal of status after the formal interview. And on the other side, the institution that might issue the certificate for granting the status of a victim of trafficking is also not clearly defined. Regarding the right to compensation, the right to compensation for victims of trafficking in Albania even is foreseen in the law. It's challenging for the implementation and for the victims to access this right, because it's followed by complicated procedures and because it needs professional lawyers that very often we lack these professional lawyers. In Albania, there are only 2 cases that have managed to win a lawsuit for compensation as victims of trafficking. One was in 2010 and another one in 2018. But even for these 2 cases, the execution of compensation decisions has not been possible. This is even due to the fact that in Albania, we do not have a state funding scheme to compensate victims of trafficking, and to guarantee the compensation and the execution of positive court decisions even are very few, only 2, but at least these to be executed. Meanwhile, despite the efforts made, there is still no alternative out of court mechanism that enables the compensation of victims of trafficking. So this right, the access to this right remain really challenging in our country. I would like to conclude with some actions for improvements. So free legal aid is not only an important basic right for the protection of victims of trafficking, but it is a precondition for the fulfillment of other rights for the victims of trafficking. And based on the findings of the RENATE report and the challenges that I already mentioned coming from the practice, it's time to undertake important joint measures in order to improve the situation of legal aid for victims of trafficking in our countries. We in Albania, we do not have an anti-trafficking law. Even there, we have ratified the Palermo Protocol since on 2002, but still we are missing a comprehensive anti-trafficking law for the protection of victims of trafficking. And this law could serve as an integral legal act that ensures the protection of victims of trafficking, including the right for legal aid. So we are lobbying hard to have this law in our country, and we will continue to work until we will realize this special measure. We are also working for the creation of a national network of specialized lawyers for providing free legal aid for victims of trafficking. And as it was even in the RENATE report's findings, also for creating especially a pro bono lawyers network in our country. As even in the RENATE report, even from the practice, we see that other deep analysis and research is needed in terms of improving access to justice for legal aid for victims of trafficking, nationally and internationally. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mariana, and certainly provoke some questions that will come at the end, I think. My next person to speak I'll introduce is Annie Bannister. Annie is a legal officer with the police in South Yorkshire, which is the part of the north of England. The police have their own modern slavery unit, which focuses primarily on disrupting trafficking gangs. She has worked with a number of anti-modern slavery organisations in the UK and across Europe, and has been involved in a campaign on access to justice and to legal aid. Prior to her legal training, she was a marketing specialist. Over to you, Annie.
Hello, everybody. It's very, very nice to be here, and thank you for the invite to talk to you all. I'm going to focus a little bit on the UK today. UK was one of 6 countries that were looked at in this research, and many people who are maybe not from the UK on this webinar may feel the UK would be leading the way in making the right choices about victim-centred responses when it comes to modern slavery. And indeed, in 2015, the UK was one of the first countries to produce their own laws connected with modern slavery. However, here we are 7 years on, and there are some frustrating, challenging times ahead in the UK in terms of how victims' rights appear to be slipping away. So I've put some figures on the slide. They are meant to not necessarily focus on the individual figures, but I just want you to get the overall feel of the problem of assistance for victims of modern slavery. So you can see the great big sort of red area shows these are all victims of modern slavery, and Unseen, which is a very renowned organisation in the UK, have estimated about 136,000 victims of modern slavery are in the UK at the moment. And what happens in the UK, as in many other countries, those that are seeking asylum from other countries that have come to the UK, some of those, while they're taken down a different route, are actually victims of modern slavery. And that's potentially the reason why they're making asylum claims. But what I want you to focus on now is this green circle. Now, the green circle, the people that fall into that group are the only ones in the UK that have access to legal aid. So while you see there's huge, all the red are victims of modern slavery, the ones in the green are the ones that are allowed access. They may not all get it, but actually have access to that free legal aid from the government. This is just 7% of victims that can, by joining the National Referral Mechanism, they do get that extra free legal help, at least on paper. I've also put a little note on here. 437 days at the moment is how the UK government are doing from when someone goes into the National Referral Mechanism to actually getting their conclusive grounds decision. During that 437 days, while the government are assessing whether their modern slavery claim is actually something they're going to take notice of, they go into what we call a victim care contract. And this is headed up by the Salvation Army. in the UK, and there's some great support providers for people who are in that national referral mechanism, i.e. all those that are in that green circle here. Another interesting point just to say is asylum seekers in the UK, of which we have around 31,000 a year, which is lower actually than other developed countries like France and Germany and so on. Roughly about half of those who are found to be victims of trafficking don't ever get into the national referral mechanism. So an estimate is 15% of them are found to be victims of trafficking, but only half of them go into the national referral mechanism and therefore get some free legal aid. This map here shows that if somebody is entitled to free legal aid, they actually have to use a legal provider in the UK that has something called an immigration legal aid contract. And all these red dots on the map show you where these legal aid contract holders are in the country. And you can see if you look at, say, Wales, which is this part of the country, they're very thin on the ground. So if you are a victim of modern slavery in Wales, it's really very tough to get with a lawyer that will have the right legal aid contract to allow you to have free legal advice. So it's a bit of a lottery as to where you go. And you know, while there are shelters all over the country, which you may be taken to if you've entered the national referral mechanism, it's not necessarily aligned to where there are good legal provision who have these legal aid contracts. And as I say, there's just 248 in the UK, which is less than 2% of all legal firms in the UK. So of those 10,000 or so, so about 7% that are able to go into the NRM and are identified, you know, what sort of free legal help can they get? Well, they can get legal aid for asylum advice, assistance during criminal proceedings, then representation if they indeed are going up against a criminal charge themselves. And there is a range of sort of advice and representation offered under this victim care contract, such as submitting claims such as asylum or benefits claims. Again, legal support for leave to enter or remain in the country. However, the vast majority of legal processes, such as claiming compensation, would not necessarily fall under the legal aid banner within the UK. You'd have to go through a range of different hoops, and it's finding the right lawyer that knows about those. And obviously, the victim of modern slavery, it's a lottery whether they have put in front of the lawyer that might know about these things. So now I want to tell you about a new law that is currently going through the Houses of Parliament, which has an awful lot in there about changing the law for victims of modern slavery. It's actually called the UK Nationality and Borders Bill, and it's very, very close to being enacted. So you can see all these ticks down here. It's actually at the almost through the House of Lords, and then all it requires, and these are really rubber stamping these final stages. So it's looking very likely that this law is going to come into being. Now, why is it that modern slavery law falls under an Immigration Act? This is what the UK government have decided, and 25% of this bill is all focused on changes made to modern slavery law. So I want to take you through some of the things that are going to happen when this law comes in terms of how it affects victims of modern slavery. So the first, and these are several items, all which would be considered as negative on the victim. So the first of all, at the moment in UK law, the victim of trafficking gets 45 days to reflect and recover before they are then moved on in terms of the next stage of the process. And I know this was mentioned earlier by Brian about this period of reflection and recovery, and that it should be in all EU member states, even though the UK isn't in the EU anymore. You know, it started off in that situation. Now, what's happening when this law comes in, that period of reflection recovery will go down to 30 days. We all know how traumatized victims of modern slavery are, and for them to have less time to consider their situation before they have to make very important decisions about what happens next in their journey to recovery is really, really hard for them. The next area is, and this is a legal state, when victims of trafficking are considered, their application is considered, they are either looked at as a positive conclusive grounds decision. This means they have positively been identified as a victim of modern slavery. That process is taking about 437 days in the UK to reach that decision. Up until now, all that's had to happen when that decision's made is that there's a reasonable degree of likelihood that they are a modern slavery victim. So there is some evidence there from what's been looked at, but certainly not necessarily enough evidence to say they are more likely than not. So on the balance of probabilities is the new status that has to be achieved before a victim of trafficking will get that positive conclusive grounds decision. And so the bar is going to raise significantly. Approximately 91% of people that go into the NRM are found to be victims of modern slavery. We anticipate that that's going to go down significantly because of this change. There's going to be a higher standard of evidence that's needed in order for them to get that conclusive grounds decision. So on to the next one. We all know that when someone is trafficked, a very large proportion, very sadly, go on to be re-trafficked. And this new law is saying that actually, if you're re-trafficked, you don't have any right at all to have another period of reflection and recovery. You can only ever have one. Again, very hard on the victim. And then we go on to, if a victim of trafficking is also making an immigration claim, and we know that about 40% of victims of trafficking in the UK are looking at have some immigration issues as well. They are now, with this new law, going to be issued with a trafficking notice, which means they have to provide certain claim information by a given date. So it's going to create this two-tier system for victims. Those that have immigration issues as well, they're going to find it even more traumatic and harder to actually get through this process of proving that they are a victim of modern slavery. And then on the sort of same principle, really, what they're looking at as well, that if a victim of trafficking can be seen as a threat to public order or has perhaps had a criminal history in a previous location that they've been in, that they can now be disqualified from the NRM, so they can be thrown out of that. Again, very scary and will definitely have a negative effect on victims of trafficking. So I just want to finish off on saying that there are some positives that I'm pleased to report to this new Borders and Nationalities bill that is coming in. First of all, that they are adding to the amount of legal aid that is available to victims of trafficking. And this particularly focuses on the area of when they're first told about the NRM, the victim of trafficking, they're allowed to claim up to 7 hours additional legal advice and help in making that decision and whether to go into the NRM or not. So that's very welcome. And the other side is, at the moment, victims of trafficking in the UK do not automatically qualify for leave to remain in the country. They have to go through an immigration process to also claim that right as well at the moment. But what this new Act will give victims is an automatic right. It will be time limited to remain in the country to all confirmed victims of trafficking. But again, going back to that first slide I showed, we're only seeing about 7% of those victims that would have that additional leave to remain right. So to just finish off, victim-centred organisations are very concerned generally that this new act is going to make it harder for victims of trafficking to access their rights, access justice. And, you know, please do read the research report that Brian will be putting out in the link, because there is specific detailed information on each of the 6 countries that we researched to show, you know, what rights different victims have, how difficult it is in most of these markets to access the rights that we all feel they should have. But, you know, I would just like to say that, you know, one interesting thing that's coming out of the UK, which I think we can thank the NRM for, is that now 71% of victims identified last year were males. And I know this is a women-centric event that we're on, but it's very interesting that they are bringing out more and more sort of forced labour victims of modern slavery, and it's great that those are being identified. So thank you very much for your time today, and I hope you found this of interest.
Thank you very much, Annie, for that very detailed run through the complex legal situation in the UK. We have a short film now, which is the story of 3 religious sisters working against human trafficking. So this will give you a little bit of slight emphasis change from listening to lectures and listening to talks. So Brian, can we show that film now? Thank you, Annie. Are we?
It's a hidden trade in human beings, but you've probably never seen it. It happens beyond our gaze.
Trafficking is a business. It's either the second or the third largest income generator for organised crime in the world.
Unfortunately, victims of trafficking are seen first and foremost as migrants. They seem to be criminalised again and again.
Yo he creado relaciones con estas mujeres fuertes en este campo de la prostitución, de la trata, de la inmigración. Aprendí a conocer mi alma también, mi interior.
There's no doubt about it that we have something more powerful than any other trafficking network. We have a trusted relationship as female sisters working across the world.
we decided on our own to pick up that apostolate.
So we go to the street to meet them, to try to leave the street and give them possibilities.
Esto es así en la unidad, una unidad móvil con todo lo que sirve para venir en encuentro a las mujeres de la calle.
Mendoj që shkaku numër 1 në Shqipëri I trafikimit dhe I gjanave që ndodhin me femrën janë numri 1 është pagesa, është ekonomia.
La alegría más grande, ¿no? Que alguna se decida a hacer el camino de retorno y encuentre una vida nueva. Esperamos que hagan un trabajo psicológico, pero es un proceso largo, muy largo y muy difícil.
Le famiglie non accettano, non ci sono altri punti di riferimento, noi dobbiamo essere pronti di accogliere.
Siento la necesidad de interagir con todas las religiones, con todas las culturas y con toda la creación, ¿no?
We, as sisters, we're a million.
Thank you very much for that. And now we'll move on to our last speaker, who is Yvonne van der Kar. Yvonne lives in the Netherlands, and she has worked against human trafficking for 25 years, mainly in prevention, awareness raising, and network building. She's a member of Sister Works and an NGO in the Netherlands, but she's also a member of RENATE, and she's going to talk about 22 years of anti-trafficking law, what has been achieved. Thank you, Yvonne.
Thank you, Mary. I'm sharing my screen, so I hope you can all read it. I had some difficulties last night, so I leave it like this. I want to start by telling you that the Netherlands was not a part of this study. So I will not share too many details about the Dutch law, but I want to start by telling you how the law against human trafficking in the Netherlands came into existence and why. And after a few minutes, I will give you some overall information on information of the EU with numbers of all over Europe. Let me see how to... So, human trafficking and the law. In 1999, the Netherlands prepared their first anti-trafficking law. The concern was there from different sides. There was a law and order concern, the crime fighting part, but there was also concern from women's organizations, concern for women victims. In those days, we had no idea that also men could become victim of human trafficking. We didn't even call it human trafficking at that time, and we thought only exploitation in prostitution was happening. Years of fighting but discussions between women's groups and law enforcement ended with in those days. And one of the things that changed is one of the police officers, a very well-known vice detective, he trained to be a social worker, and his colleagues trusted him, and the social workers and the women's groups also trusted him. And at that same time, a social worker, a women's advocate, trained to become a human rights lawyer. Her colleagues trusted her, and law enforcement trusted her also. And in the end, all of them agreed that they were all trying to work for the same purpose, helping the victims. So the first constructive talks about how to stop the criminal networks and how to help the victims were started. Before 1999, the Dutch prostitution law was only a brothel ban. Running a brothel was a crime, earning money on exploitation of another person was a crime. Facilitating the prostitution of a person was a crime. But prostitution in itself was no crime, and it has never been a crime. And in many countries, that is the case. From 1911, a woman in prostitution was considered a victim of circumstances or a victim of force. Street prostitution, drug addicts trying to earn money in prostitution, that was the general idea. In the 70s and 80s, policies of tolerance were very common here in the Netherlands, and well-organized Dutch cities had to find clean solutions for street and car prostitution. I will show you the photos in a minute. Law enforcement and social workers agreed this had to stop. Interesting is that Sweden at the same time had the same discussion with the opposite result. I will not go into that now. This is how these neat solutions looked like. On the first photo and on the second, the one on the both on top, you can see the constructions that municipalities built for cars to park for women who were working in prostitution to do their job, and then the men could drive away. And on the two photos on the bottom, you see some of the typical window brothels that we had in the city of Utrecht on the canals, where there were these canal boats. They were brothels, they were window brothels, and then the cars could just drive past. And well, you can see here how it looks. And everybody felt that this has to stop. We needed a law. We needed to have boundaries, what is allowed and what is illegal. Police, law enforcement, they were trained to fight what was not allowed and to arrest those who earn money with this crime. The prostitution sector, everybody knew already in that time, was heavily connected to organized crime. Help the women and girls, victims. As I said before, there was no knowledge of male victims. And it also made that there was more finances for social work and for anti-trafficking work, because this was all part of the new law. And there was also money for that by the government. And this law was also needed to assist the exploited foreign victims from Asia and Latin America. The women and girls working in the Netherlands in prostitution at that time were mainly from Asia and Latin America, Philippines and Latin America. And there was this first rise of women from the Philippines when the army bases in the Philippines closed and many of the girls were out of work. And then these criminal networks made them or offered them a job here to work in prostitution. And that's how there was this high number of migrant workers in prostitution at that time. So this law was coming about, but then the world changed. At that moment, in also about 99, 2000, internet came into our lives, and the whole sex industry changed. The sex ads in newspapers disappeared, and international crime organizations from Eastern Europe got involved. At the same time, we also saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it was for these criminal organizations cheaper to get women from Eastern European countries than to get a woman from the Philippines or from the Dominican Republic. Because of internet, street prostitution disappeared. Well, it's not only because of internet, but also because the law was working. So city after city, all the street prostitution disappeared. The window brothels stayed. But one of the biggest problems was that the women, the police officers who were trained to go and visit the women and to check their paperwork and everything, the women told the police they were working there voluntarily. And earning money is a right of every person. So that was one of the problems with this beginning in this law. And then this new phenomenon that we found was that young Dutch girls were found to work in window brothels for the guy they loved. And we started calling them lover boys. So at the same time, there was, for the first time, an international accepted definition of human trafficking, and that was produced at the UNODC meeting in Palermo. So the United Nations had the definition that everybody agreed on and everybody still works with, and it's called the Palermo Protocol. And as far as I'm concerned, I think all international legislation is based on that definition of human trafficking, also our Dutch law. The only problem that we have with that is that it's a crime-fighting law and it's not a human rights law. So many of the things that, like Annie was speaking about, it's all because it fights crime and it's not there to help the victims. So that's one of the things I will not go into deeper, but well, for time's sake. So now I will tell you a little bit more about the EU facts on human trafficking. And you can find it. I will copy the link into the chat afterwards. Because it's a very short and comprehensive information on Europe on human trafficking. So who are the victims in Europe? In Europe, we have seen officially 14,145 victims of trafficking that were registered in the EU in 2017 and 18. And despite efforts, this represents a higher number than in previous reporting periods. But I think we all know that it's the tip of the iceberg. As far as we are concerned, perhaps only 10% of the, or even that is a high estimation, is really registered. And then women and girls are the main victims of this serious and organized crime. 72% of all registered victims were women and girls. And women and girls were the vast majority, so 92% of the victims of human trafficking for sexual exploitation in the EU. Children are accounted for 22% of all victims. Nearly 3/4 of, so 74% of all child victims were EU citizens. The majority, 64%, were trafficked for purpose of sexual exploitation. And the vast majority of these child victims, 78%, are girls. So half of the victims that were registered in Europe were EU citizens, and nearly half, so 49% of all victims of trafficking, and more than 1/3 of all victims were trafficked in their own EU member state. So that leaves a discussion with the UK on migration, and if you do not miss a lot of human trafficking then. Particular concerns: criminal methods used by traffickers have changed due to the extensive use of internet and social media and the deployment of technology in many stages of the trafficking chain. As we heard Imelda saying in the beginning, we had a training on exploitation by children online. This is something we couldn't have imagined when we started to do this work. Then another concern is an increased risk of trafficking in the context of migration. Especially now, today and the last week, we have been very busy with helping our colleagues in the border areas of Ukraine, because so many people are now migrating and are now running for the war. And many people are also from the Netherlands, from Germany, from many countries are going to the border areas to help people. And many of them are doing this with a very good heart, but are also people who come to the rescue and have bad intentions. And we have to warn people about that. And that's something we are doing. So the context of migration, and especially women and unaccompanied minors. And also you can imagine that now so many people on the move in Ukraine, this is a big concern. A third concern is the marginalized communities, vulnerable people, men, women, and children, including marginalized Roma communities, are particularly at risk of being targeted by traffickers for sexual exploitation, for labor exploitation, for forced begging, forced criminality, forced scam marriages. And COVID-19 increases in these vulnerabilities and the risk of trafficking for sexual and labor exploitation. Another interesting point is the culture of impunity. The high number of registered victims, or relatively high number, 11,788 suspects. So the high number of registered victims call for a strong response against the impunity of the perpetrators and make the trafficking crime a high-risk, low-profit crime. But as you can see, there have been 11,788 suspects. There were 6,163 prosecutions, and there were 2,426 convictions. So that's not very, very high. And then what are the areas of progress? Considerable progress has been made in several areas, including transnational cooperation, as you heard that we as a European network are also doing, cross-border law enforcement, and judicial operation actions. Another thing is that in 2019, the work of all the European framework and the platform have resulted in 825 arrests, 8,824 suspects, and 1,307 potential victims, including 69 children, only in 2019. And this was done by 94 organized crime groups identified or dismantled, and 1.5 million assets frozen in bank accounts. So that's something that really is a positive thing. And I thought it was good to end in a positive way, because if you join together your forces like we do in RENATE with all our members in the different countries, you can really make a difference. So Mary, that was my presentation.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Thank you. And thank you to all our speakers. We have a quick film which we plan to show, and then we have had one question in the Q&A. So I've asked the panelists to have a read of it and be ready to answer it after the film. And we'll try and finish on time at 3:30, 4:30, whatever time we're.
Why would you think someone could be in a really awful way behind that door? And you don't want to think it because it's uncomfortable. They can only sell a gun once. You can sell a girl 100 times. Every visitor will take like a backpack with alarm. You have a pay-as-you-go mobile phone on you, and for example, you wear shoes and come running. It's not just that wall that's the barrier, it's like their language, it's the society, it's the shame, it's everything. It's just makes them not feel that they can walk out the door and say help. We questioned at the beginning, why aren't they shut down? Because you know that they're all here. I used to just wander around, say hey, and go out on nights out, and you just kind of laugh at the sex shop and stuff. I think that's how it cleverly keeps its powers hidden in plain sight. So by shutting that down, actually, it just pushes it underground.
Thank you very much. That was one of the films, I think, from the RENATE Film Festival from last year. So there was a question which Catherine Keir sent, saying that she felt, as many people did, that although they keep themselves informed and support with moral support and prayer and some financial help, they feel there's little more else they can do. What advice would you give the people who really want to help and feel, if you like, powerless? So who would like to first answer that? Yes, Brian.
Thank you, Catherine, for the question. And I took the question mainly because I think you're a sister in England, where we also have sisters in England. And one of the things, or some of the things that we did, is we collaborated with others where we couldn't go it alone. We became aware because it became a problem where we lived, because we mentioned earlier that this issue is a problem in every town and every space. You heard Annie earlier mention where some of the services are not available, like Wales and parts of the rural countryside and so on. However, when we started, we did our best to find out what was going on locally. Once we found that out, we found out who was involved locally and how we could become involved. Sister Imelda mentioned how the sisters have a particular place when it comes to those who are trafficked, in the sense that they are people of sanctuary and that they are a trusted person where others are not trusted. And we mentioned that earlier too. So the sisters have a space, and therefore you have a role. And I wouldn't like to say it's an imperative, but you can do good in this space. You can. I would read the research. I would make myself more aware of what's going on. I'd become familiar in the town that I'm in. I would also notice that in England, for example, the third most likely victim is an English person in the United Kingdom. So above them are Albanians and Vietnamese people. And although everybody is caught out, we all have a role to play. So if I were you, I would even take this step during the CSW66, and coming so soon after International Women's Day, is to listen with an open heart. And if that was the message you went away with today, And that means that you're prepared to take up some of the challenges that you heard today and you brought it to somebody else. That's a good starting point. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Brian. Anybody else? Yvonne, you wanted to come in on that as well?
Just wanted to add to what Brian so brilliant has said. I've given a lot of information and I've done a lot of awareness raising. And what I always say to people, if you speak to your friends, your relatives, people you are having coffee with this evening or tomorrow, and you tell them, you know what I heard yesterday, and just talk about it. That's already a start. You don't have to become you know, a fighter in this work, but just inform people and tell people what you've heard, and that already makes a start.
Thank you very much, Annie, and then Imelda.
Okay, so all I wanted to say was be aware of certain industries that are more likely to have victims of trafficking. So, you know, we notice nail bars, we notice car washes. There are a whole list of industries where they're more likely to have victims of trafficking. So when you go and have your car wash, you know, look at who's doing it, look how they're treated, see whether they look nervous. And there are ways to report if you do suspect that there is a problem happening.
Thank you. Imelda?
I know that Sister Catherine is an educator and has massive influence in schools around UK. And I have a dream, and it's not just my dream, because I'm part of an awareness raising task group. And our challenge that we've given each other is to see if over a year, every single country in RENATE has, every member has at least been in one school and raised awareness against human trafficking. Because we're actually aware that most children, young people, do not know about this. And in fact, many people do not know about this in the UK. So I have a dream of a kind of a task group in volunteers in a country going around raising awareness, because most people are beginning to say it's one of the key tasks to combat human trafficking is education.
Thank you. Mariana?
Just to add one measure more, we believe that mobilization of communities, of every person, is very important. We see that communities have the problems, but also they have the solutions. So besides all what my colleagues said, I would add that act is very important from every individual. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's one other question, which I think is a it's a question that maybe Brian or Annie can answer, which was, how many of the 6 countries studied in the law report have anti-trafficking laws or state-funded compensation in place?
If I'm correct, I think 4 that I could see. However, I could stand corrected on that. But what I might say about the compensation is that I think it was Mariana pointed out that it's extremely difficult to access compensation, even if a claim is won. And part of the difficulty is that the access to compensation very often becomes a civil claim after, if you like, there has been a prosecution, or after. It's also a case too that where somebody has been identified, if they have been repatriated, you're trying cross-jurisdictionally to try and access compensation for somebody who may not be a citizen in that country, but maybe somewhere else. And these guys can move so quickly. And so it's often a case too that victims are so happy to get home. And it's been such a difficult process, as Annie outlined. If you looked at the detail in Annie's, how difficult it is to become part of a system, that you are traumatized, not just by the events that have occurred, but by the system that has re-traumatized you. Are you going to go back into a system to claim compensation willingly? It's a big ask.
I could come in.
Yeah, Annie.
Just to say, the UK is one of the 4 countries that Brian mentioned that does offer state compensation. However, as recent, whenever I look at a completed case which involves modern slavery, the percentage of gains taken from those criminals that go back to the victims is either nothing or a very, very small amount. There is also a state scheme in the UK where victims, if they've had personal injury as part of their journey of being a modern slave, they can go and try and claim for that. But again, there are difficulties because the UK puts a 2-year time limit in place to make that claim. So if the injury happened 3 years ago, before the claim started, then generally that would mean that that victim would not have any, would be able to access that.
Thank you very much. So I don't see any other questions. So we're slightly over the time that we thought we would be running this. So that demonstrates the wealth of information and enthusiasm from the audience and from the speakers. So on your behalf, I'm going to thank all the speakers and thank the audience for staying with us for so long, and hope that they have a very successful rest of the time in CSW or in the work that they're doing. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to our communication person to terminate the meeting. Is there anybody anything else to say?
Thank you, Mary.
Okay, thank you all, and all the best.
Thanks everybody.
Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.